I want to talk about pushing black and white film. Before I get going, some consistent feedback that I've had on my YouTube videos is that I'm very slow, right? Even at 1.5 or 2x, I'm slow, right? I've had 3 cups of coffee in preparation for this video, but I'm still gonna be slow. Partly this is just because I'm sort of a slow person, but also because my videos are very much a mix of I'm here to share something with you and maybe teach you something, but equally I'm allowing myself the time to slow down and be thoughtful and actually sort of use this as my own process for improving. Right, and that's where things kind of really slow down, is because I'm actually really thinking about things. All right, with that out of the way, right, you might just decide to 2x me or wait till YouTube comes out with a 3x option. But here we go. I definitely shoot film because I like the look of pushed film. This is an example of somebody who I think is a master of it, right? This is Josef Koudelka, 1966. One of his images from his book, Gypsies. And this is one of my favorite photographs. Most of his photographs are my favorite photographs. And it's taken me a while to and I'm still doing it, right? Is figuring out why I love it. And I've always sort of had to continue to go back to his work to sort of compare his to mine, to sort of reorient myself or just kind of calibrate my compass. Now, this style, this isn't appropriate for every type of work or image, but it is an option that I want to be able to mimic. So I've been chasing it for a long time, and I've learned a fair amount about pushing film. And I think there's probably a lot of people who are maybe coming from digital or whatever and just know a little bit about pushing film. So my goal here is to help somebody who doesn't know much about pushing film to learn quite a bit. But then I'm also, the selfish part is I've sort of been leaning on 2 different strategies to get the pushed look. And I wanted to shoot them side by side and sort of figure out really which one I was going to favor. So I did that, and I'm going to share pictures and thinking, etc. All right, here's an outline of sort of my experiment here. I shot 2 rolls side by side using 2 cameras. They both had Kodak Double-X. For each scene, I took 2 pictures. One where I rated at 800, which for Double-X is like a stop and 2/3 underexposed. That's almost 2 stops underexposed. And then another one that's even another stop underexposed, rated at 1600. So 2 shots that are very underexposed, one a full stop more underexposed. I'm passing the same lens back and forth between the 2 cameras. It's like a 35 Summilux pre-aspherical, and I'm leaving the aperture the same for all the shots. Then for the first roll, I developed it with a very aggressive push. so aggressive that it's not even in the developer directions. So I took Xtol undiluted, super fresh, and I warmed it up to 90 degrees, and I developed for 9 minutes. Agitation every 30 for the first 2 minutes, and then every minute. Okay, this is what, if you compare this to what's in the Xtol directions, this is right above and beyond anything that they would recommend. So it is a full-blown push. Now, just a little bit of commentary of like, if you're looking for just some quick developers for aggressive pushing, right? So DDX, D76 or ID11, and I'm trying Xtol. I need to come back around and compare those three developers and see if I have a favorite. But right now I'm using Xtol. Okay, for the second roll, I'm not even really technically pushing, but I am just going for a boost in the shadows, right? That's another way to try to just get some speed, to be able to shoot at maybe like an 800 or a 1600. And so here I'm highly diluting the developer. So 1:4, 1 part developer to 4 parts water. And it's just one roll in 500 mLs of developer and only 80 degrees. But now I go 18 minutes. I'm only agitating every second minute. Now, because it's a dilute developer and I'm not agitating as much, that leaves the shadows, places where it's not using much developer. Right? There's not really any exhaustion of the developer. There continues to be enough for the shadows to be able to develop consistently and constantly. But things like your highlights, they start to get some level of exhaustion because it's a dilute developer. You're not replenishing it by agitating. And so it has a compensation effect on your highlights. It keeps them from running away. But the extended time helps with boosting your shadows. So it's not a push, but it is a way of getting some speed, right? Speed with film is about increasing you can rate it at 800 and still get some shadow information. Okay, this is the technical sheet Kodak provides for Double-X. This graph here, we have exposure on the x-axis. Right, so more exposure is going to the right. And then density of the negative on the y-axis. And it's showing us that we can do, if we do more development, then our curve is going to steepen, and we're going to get more density. But what's important to pay attention to is that the difference in the highlights, for example, is much larger than the difference in the shadows. Right? The amount of push, think of it as pushing the density, right? The push is much greater further up into the exposure, the highlights, the midtones and highlights. It's not at all a linear push. Really, your deepest shadows are barely moving. And if you pay attention over here to the far left, that's your fog level. So kind of your deepest shadows, yeah, they're moving up a little bit, but so is your fog level. So your ability to differentiate them is not really changing much at all. But on the other end, your highlights are really, really changing. You're going from a density here of like 1 to like 2.5, right? That's going from like a decent, maybe a little thin negative to one that's really dense. So the first roll, I developed it with a pretty extreme push, and I actually think that I'm probably close to this top line. It's interesting that they don't actually, Kodak doesn't actually recommend this gamma in any of their developer recommendations. They top out here. So I think, and if I just kind of look at my overall density that I got, I think my roll 1 is pretty darn close to this top line. And I can see that. I can see that I have a little bit higher fog level. I can tell that my density's got up to around here. Okay. Now my other roll, it's not really on here because it's sort of untraditional where I let it sit for a while in a dilute developer. And it's a little more something like this. And then a little bit of compensation on the highlights. It's a little like that. But what we'll see in the examples is the shadows are going to not be that different. But where we're really going to see a big difference is in the midtones and especially the highlights. All right, here's a quick picture of the negatives. So the top one is right, that first development, that giant push. You can see that our highlights, these flowers, have gone to a density probably above 2. Right, compare that to down below where we're using the other development, and the highlights are very well controlled, as in like they did not run away. Right, they basically look like, you know, a density of maybe just over 1. You can tell a little bit that the top one, the fog level is a little bit higher. And then, right, we look at the shadows though, this black cat, maybe the head, right? You can see that the sort of the shadow detail is not that different. We're going to look at photos. I just wanted to quickly show the negatives. Now, you know, what I've been thinking, and it's sort of the reason I was inspired to do the test, is that I might be able to use this bottom one as a way to like get a little bit of a speed boost, right? Be able to shoot at maybe 800, and then edit in the push look, because I'll know I'll have not had anything totally run away on me and get super dense. So in some ways it feels safer to do the bottom one. Still get a little speed boost, edit in the push. Versus a hard push, you might think, well man, if depending on the contrast in the scene, or maybe you miss your exposure a little bit, you could get some highlights that get super dense. Right? And that could be, you'd think, maybe a source of trouble if you're in the dark room or if you're scanning and you got a super dense negative. So this is what I was curious about, right? Is to compare these options. Now let's come back here for a minute and talk about what happens when you shoot at box speed and then follow, you know, roughly normal development. So let's say that at the film plane you've only got maybe a little more than 3 stops of exposure range. So something like this, right? That's 3 1/3 stops of exposure range at the film plane. So then you come up here, you can see that, how that would play out on these different developments. Right? The more you develop, you're going to get a greater range of densities. But they're all on the straight line of the curve. So as long as you set your black point and your white point, all of these images are going to look about the same. Like very similar. Things start to change when we get off the straight line portion and we get into either the toe or way up into the shoulder. So when you're underexposing by 2 stops-ish, right now you're down here. So, right, you can tell that this stuff is going to behave differently than up here, right? This is no longer straight. Right, we're taking this part. Okay, that's what's happening when we're pushing, is we're down in here. Typically, right? So now when we just set a black point and a white point, the images are no longer going to look the same, right? The same is true when we get up to the shoulder. So what's sort of hiding here is that, right, we have kind of the behavior of what happens at the shoulder depends a lot on the developer and the development. But here, like if we kept going to the extreme on this one, at some point you just can't get any more density. Okay, and if you keep going a really long time, you'll actually go the other way. That's called solarization. Okay, and then my second development, right, because of that compensation effect, right, there's actually exhaustion happening at the highlights. So it's a long, gentle shoulder, and it tops out right here. But again, if this is where we get to, because of whatever our exposure was or how far we develop, right, we now get different types of image quality from here and here, and it's not the same, not something we can just quickly compensate for. All right, the last thing I want to do before we look at my images. How do I know that Koudelka's photo is pushed? Well, I happen to know that he's shooting a 400 speed cinema film. He's indoors using f4 on a 25mm Flectagon lens in an Exacta camera. He's shooting at 1/30th of a second. And I know he pushed this because he said so. Now by looking at it, I can tell that there's very little shadow information. The pants are black, the sides of the face are black, the hair are black. The boy in the bottom right corner, or you can tell that in the darkroom they had to dodge that substantially to get any detail out of that shadow. And then from the mid-tone up to the highlight, you can tell that's a runaway train, and the highlights have really popped out the top. And it's very grainy. Okay, grain, after you've picked your film, right, mostly depends on 2 factors. One is your exposure, right? If you barely expose, right, if you're, let's say we're calling underexposed, you're mostly just using the large film grains. When you just use the large film grains, they tend to clump together and make larger grains or graininess. So that's one of the big drivers, is just underexposure. And then the other big driver is development, right? And the short version of that is the more you develop, the grainier your photo, right? And the more density you build, the more tend towards graininess. And then just a little technical point there, that we do not see film grains. We see clumps of grains that we perceive as graininess. So, all right, to my photos. Okay, now for the fun part. Let's look at the images. So I'm going to show sets of 4. The top 2 are the aggressive push, right? And the giveaway there is you can see that the highlights are taking off. The bottom 2 are the other development, right? Let's call it the little bit of a speed boost compensation. I'll call it development B. Then on the 2 on the left are the 1600 shot, and the 2 on the right are the 800 shot. Again, Double-X is a 250 speed film. So just looking at it right here, before I've even set black points and white points, right, you can see how much more density is on the 800 shot aggressive push versus the other 800 shot, right? And again, density turns into, right, once you invert the negative, becomes highlights, right? So look at that. All right. For each of these, I'm going to quickly set the black point and the white point. Okay. Here I can still tell, like this bottom left one is almost so underexposed it's unusable. The other three have legs. All right. Then it's important with, right, I'm going for the pushed look, right? We don't expect shadow detail, so I'm going to move my black point just a little bit to know that, like, right here I'm editing this top left one, right? How crushed do I want it to be? That's too much. Back it out, right? Something like that. Just crush them a little bit, right? Just knowing that, like, right, we're expecting some shadows to be dark. I'll do the same on this one. So the problem with this bottom left one, right, is you start crushing the shadows and all of a sudden you start crushing everything. And then the bottom right one, again, right, you can see how I can have quite a bit of control over the shadows still. Okay, that's nice. So now let's come in and look at the shadows. This top left, the 1600 on the aggressive push, is sort of similar to this 800 on development B. But again, right, yeah, it's like the shadows aren't that different. But compare what's happening with the midtones and the highlights, right? The aggressive push, there's still a huge difference there. All right, going into 100% here. Right, these three all look good, but in terms of the pushed look, right, well, these are definitely pushed. Can I make this one here sort of have a pushed look? So I'm going to move my mid-tone down, but then I'm going to blow my highlights up. Something like that. Okay, so now this one is starting to look like these two up here. So this one at 800 is starting to look like the aggressive push at 1600. Right, they're close enough where some fine tinkering, you know, I might be able to figure that out. But still, the 1600 up here, one, I'm getting a whole nother bump in speed, but it's also required less editing. But also you can see how the shadows on the 800 over here, there actually is a little more depth in these shadows because of that extra exposure to the film. But this 800 up here of the aggressive push, right, I'm going to just edit that one real fast. Right, something like that. All I did was move the midtone, and now this one is rocking. Everything about it looks really good. So that one was super easy to edit. Looks fantastic. All right, I'm gonna try to go pretty fast here. Next set of 4. Again, the two that look the most alike are this one at 800 and this one at the aggressive push at 1600. The one at the aggressive push at 800, right, you can see the highlights really starting to go. All right, just kind of zoom in real quick. You can also see this one on the top left, right? Both of the ones on the top row, they are sharper. Okay, acutance sharper, right? This is a good example of it. I could try to mimic that one in down here, but the best way to mimic it is actually, oh, look at this, I actually forgot. So here's the clarity slider off. Compare this one to that one, right? This one up here has way more acutance. This down here, to even get close to the one in the top left, I have to cheat it with the clarity slider. Right, in previous videos I've said that, right, sort of the best way to explain acutance is with the clarity slider. Right, next 4. I focused on the gin. All right, come over here to the coffee. You can see how the pushed film has it's like, whoo, there go the highlights. I'm interested though is how much could I recover that if I really wanted to. Okay. I'm going to change the levels for a second just so we can really look at that the coffee bag. You know, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit grainier, right? There's that extra development has pushed up the grain. I have lost a little bit of the gradation, but I was also still able to recover some. But you can look at the text, right? Text. This one, the text is like gone. So back to just setting black points here. And then in the development B, sort of trying to fake it a little bit, let's turn up the clarity slider. Let's bring up the highlights, bring down the shadows, pop the highlights a little bit, even more. Just the mid-tone. Right, something like that. I mean, that's not bad, huh? Now on the real deal, let's grab that 800. And I'm gonna just move the midpoint to like right there. That's all I had to do, and it already looks really good. Let's crush some blacks. All right, something like that. All right, next image set. People told me I was slow. Not this time. Slow down, man. Slow down. All right. So the two on the left are the aggressive push. You might say, "Oh my gosh, look at those highlights. Those are gone." But I'm gonna just bring them back, just like that. All right. We want to lift the cat. right? You know, my favorite really with this development recipe is to shoot around 1,000 or 1250. And so for this one, I sort of hit it on both sides, the 800 and the 1600. Right, the 1600 is, there's not, I want a little bit more in the shadow just because sometimes I don't want to just crush. Like this is a good example, right, of sort of did want to bring out the shadows a little bit. But not that much. Let's bring them down, something like that. That looks good. That's too far underexposed. This one, again, I'm going to jack up the clarity slider. I'm going to make the highlights go kaboomy, right? And it's still not going to be as good as the real deal. Let me just show those two, the two 800s. Right, something like that, and then over here, clarity, right, fake acutants, pop the highlights, contrast, but still blowout, go take off on the highlights, move the midtone, bring back my cat a little bit. Yeah, not as good. Not as good. All right. Just quickly show these four. Right again. Right, right, it's the two on the diagonal there that are most similar. You can see here these highlights really started to take off. Let's go to the next set. Right, here this 1600, you can tell those shadows are pretty darn weak. Right, here these bottles in the background were like pretty deep in the shadows. Right, you can see that kind of 800 was needed to get it. This extra push was able to pull it out just a little bit. But you kind of see where my go-to speed is probably around 1,000, 1250. All right, and then I take this one and go, right, chop the blacks a little bit, move the gray, midpoint, boom, done. Right, look how good that looks. Boom. All right. I mean, look at, before I move on, these highlights are blown. So let me instead, I'll just back up the black point a little bit, but then push this a little bit. And now let's just do a little bit of recovery. Just, let's not totally lose those. Something like that. All right. Now this one was this is kind of a ridiculous shot because I actually metered like right here, which then meant the shower curtain, which there's a skylight right here in the middle of the day. Right. So this is a huge exposure range, and you can see on this 800, right, look what happened to the highlights. Right. So this is like, look at the compensation, like look at these two, right? The shadows aren't that incredibly different, but look at the highlights. Holy moly! But let's compare the 800s. This one that you almost think, is those highlights are gone, but I'll just right edit them back, bring them back. There you go. Okay, and then just look at like the difference in sharpness and acutance from that pushed. My favorite test scene. Okay. I'll set the black point and the white point on these. Notice that my level tools is sort of working backwards because I invert in Capture One. I do everything in Capture One, including the inversion. Right, going into sort of the deep shadow, right? So here it looks like this 800, right, has a lot more shadow information than this 1600. Right, I metered sort of in this area, metered and focused here. Again, you see that, right, the highlights are going. And it does sort of have, you can tell that there is more of a graininess, although I'm at 200%. Right, that extra density does add a little more graininess there. Right, let's grab the 800 pushed, and all I'm going to do is just move the mid-tone a little bit. Actually, I'm going to crush a little bit of the blacks, because come on. And then set the mid-tone a little bit. Boom. Right, there it is. And maybe that's, want to bring down some of the highlights just a little bit. Something like that. Right, and then the question is, well, what about this right, development B? Can you get there with just development B? And again, it's like I'm not spending a ton of time on these, right? If you edit enough, right, you can get a good approximation. But let's just see how fast. Let's see if I can get there. Something like that. Right, there's 100%. Again, just look at the acutance. It's like a little grainier, but also a little bit more acutance in the top one. And the shadows have a little more bite to them. All right. Next set. Right, gonna just start repeating myself a lot at this point. I do have a few more sample sets. Right, I think this one, let's see. Oh, a good place to check the shadow, right, is right here. Then it's like, how much black do I want to, how much do I want to crush my shadows, set the midpoint. Right, so here's that 800 pushed. Looks really good. So I think the takeaway for me is I definitely liked the pushed recipe better. And then this question of like, man, this place where I'm getting tons of density, right? Like, look at this, right? It's like, whoa. But, set my black point, move the midpoint. Recover my highlights just a little bit. And I'm back in business. Right, I did sort of get this glow bomb down here. I'm shooting with the pre-aspherical, right? So this is a glowy lens. Let's go into where I metered and focused the LL Bean. Again, it's like there's more acutance in the push row. Yeah, the other one, like let's just say we're willing to chop off a lot of shadow. This 1600. Right, because I'm underexposed. The last set, but maybe my favorite photo. My cat Lewis posed by these flowers. Right, notice in the push set that the flowers have taken off into the high range. Right, across the 4 images, there's not a giant difference in the shadow detail again. But even here, like the midtones, right, that pushed is getting the midtones much higher. Now, my favorite of this set was the 800 pushed, and I did edit that one to here. Love the photo, right? I like the crushed blacks. I like the popped highlights. I like the grayness of the white wall. I like that this is an f2 shot with the pre-aspherical, so I get these unsharp vignetting perimeter, right? Look at that candle. Right, I like that the flowers lost their detail. That's both the focus and also just that extra density and development. So this was just a test roll, but this was my keeper out of it. Okay, I think there are some people that are specifically interested about Double-X. So I'll just end this video with like, I guess maybe a couple quick takeaways and then speak specifically about Double-X and pushing it. So I'm definitely encouraged by the results I got from pushing. That's going to be the direction I go. Also, like with that, you can put as many rolls as you can get into the tank, you can do, right? So often with dilution, you have to worry about not having enough developer in there and cutting back on how many rolls, but not with pushing, so that's great. And this sort of like at least 800, maybe 1000, 1250, right? That type of range with this extreme pushing I'm doing is giving me the look that I'm after quite easily. So I'm going to continue to try to refine it with X-Tol, and then at some point compare it to what I would get with probably ID11, right? D76 next. Yeah. And then, you know, I'm doing 9 minutes at 90 degrees. I might consider dialing it back to 85 degrees because of my fixers. The directions say don't go over 85. I do everything at the exact same temperature. Everything is at exactly 85 degrees. And so or at 90 degrees, right? So even my fixer. So because I don't want reticulation, right? So I'm wanting very consistent temperatures. Which there's other ways to combat reticulation, but pushing Double-X, right? This aggressive X-Tol push is about as well as I've seen, right? HC110 is another good one. I know DDX and D76 are good, right? Undiluted. My sweet spot for pushing Double-X has always been like anything from like 640 to 1250, right? Maybe 1600, right? You're sort of seeing my most extreme pushing, right, in this video. To go further than that, right, you sort of need a scene that has some relatively medium to high contrast so that something is at least registering above the toe, right? So that when you right stretch it out with the push, like you get something that comes out of the shadows and rises, right? So I know some people shoot 1600 or 3200, right? But they're giving away a lot of shadow info. Right, and then this all just depends on how much exposure range is in your picture, right? Right? Is it 2 stops of information or 14 stops of exposure range, right? And not just in the scene, but getting to the film plane, right? Flare reduces a lot. But I have found Double-X to be my favorite film for pushing. I'm also doing some experiments with Trax and HP5 right now, but Double-X gives me that combination of acutance and grain and sharpness, and it also has extra sensitivity to blue compared to HP5 and Trax, which, because I'm using mostly window light, and window light is often reflected, bounced around skylight, scattered light, it often has a little bit of more of a blue color to it. Right, sort of indoors really is like the deep shade of the sun. So, and I find that when I did this video like a week ago of Trax and Double-X, right, I was sort of like, whoa, they're so similar, they're so similar, they're so similar. But there are also places where I was like, man, the shadows look pretty good at Double-X. And I don't know if that's the extra blue sensitivity, or I mean, it's also getting a little more light because, right, Trax, it was getting a little bit less light because it's a faster film. So I don't know. I've got Tri-X loaded right now, rated at 1600. But I'm also finding that like these are the scenes that I want to shoot, right? Sort of the samples I used in this that's sort of my subject matter, right? It's like window light inside my house, and Double-X is good enough for that, right? Given this set and other photos that I've gotten. So like I don't know that I have to chase more speed. If anything, it might be like more development, right, that I might be seeking. Okay. I hope you learned at least one thing. And come back more for more pictures of Lewis. Take care.